The moment I signed over the deed to my son-in-law, I told myself it was the right thing to do. That was the last time I trusted my own judgment for a very long time. My name doesn't matter much to this story. What matters is that I spent 31 years building a small but steady plumbing and heating business in Kelowna, British Columbia. Started with a used van, 2 sets of pipe wrenches, and a reputation for showing up on time. By the time I sold the company, I had 11 employees, a loyal customer base stretching from West Kelowna to Vernon, and enough in the bank to live comfortably without ever worrying again. I was 63 years old. My wife had passed 4 years earlier from pancreatic cancer, and I was alone in a house that felt 3 sizes too large. My daughter had married her husband 7 years before all of this happened. I'll call him my son-in-law, because that's what he was. Technically, though I use the word now the way you'd use the word guest for someone who stayed too long and left your silverware missing. He was charming in the way that men who've never worked particularly hard tend to be. Easy smile, quick with a joke, always had an opinion on your situation, but never seemed to have a firm grip on his own. He sold insurance, or said he did. I never saw him hustle. I never saw him worried about money the way people who've actually earned it tend to worry. My daughter, she was different. She had her mother's eyes and her mother's stubbornness, which I'd always taken as a compliment until it started working against me. She loved him. That's the truth I had to sit with for a long time afterward. She genuinely loved him, and I think that made everything harder, not easier. They'd been renting a condo in Penticton, nothing spectacular, and when my son-in-law mentioned they were thinking about buying, I made an offer before he even finished the sentence. I told my daughter I'd co-sign the mortgage and cover the down payment, $42,000, as an early inheritance, something to help them get established. She cried. He shook my hand and called me the best father-in-law a man could ask for. I remember feeling good about that. I remember thinking it meant something. The house went into both their names. I didn't ask to be on the title. I didn't think I needed to be. It was a gift, freely given, the kind of thing you do for your children, because you remember what it felt like to start from nothing. 6 months after they moved in, my daughter called me on a Thursday evening, voice quiet, and said they were struggling with the mortgage payments. My son-in-law's income had been inconsistent. She didn't say he'd stopped working. She said inconsistent. I wired them $4,000 that weekend and didn't bring it up again. It happened 4 more times over the next 14 months. I want to be clear about something. I never once sat down and added those numbers together while I was doing it. That's not wisdom. That's just what you do when it's your child on the other end of the phone, and she sounds like she's trying not to cry. You don't do the math, you just help. It was my accountant, a careful woman I'd worked with since the mid-90s, who finally sat me down in her office on Pandosy Street and slid a printed summary across the desk without saying a word. In just under 2 years, I had transferred, or given approximately $94,000 to my daughter and son-in-law, between the down payment, the mortgage supplements, and what I'd started calling grocery runs in my own head, though I knew they weren't buying groceries with all of it. I stared at that number for a long time. My accountant poured me a coffee and left me alone in her boardroom. When I finally drove home that afternoon, I didn't call my daughter. I just sat in my driveway in the truck with the engine off, watching the light change over the lake, and I thought about the expression on my son-in-law's face the last time I'd seen him. It had been at Easter. He'd shown up in a new jacket, some brand I didn't recognize, but I recognized what it cost. My daughter had deflected when I mentioned it, said he'd gotten a good month. I hadn't pushed. I started paying attention after that. Nothing dramatic at first. Just watching. The kind of low-key awareness that comes from decades of running a business, where you learn early that the numbers in the story people tell you about the numbers are almost never exactly the same thing. 3 weeks later, my son-in-law called me himself. That was unusual. Normally, my daughter was the one who called. He was cheerful, which was also unusual for a call that I suspected was leading somewhere I didn't want to go. He said he wanted to talk about a business opportunity. He said he'd been doing some reading about real estate investment. He said he had a friend, always a friend, who was putting together a small group of private investors for a pre-construction development outside Kamloops. He said he thought my money was sitting idle and this could really move the needle. I told him I'd think about it. I didn't sleep well that night, not because I was angry, because something had shifted. I'd always told myself that what I gave them was given freely, no strings, no expectations. But sitting in the dark at 2 in the morning, I understood for the first time that what he had just done was not ask me for help. He had looked at me and seen a resource. There's a difference. It took me 63 years to learn it clearly, but there is a difference. I said no to the investment. He didn't argue, which surprised me. He just said, "Fair enough. I figured it was worth asking." Then he asked, almost as an aside, whether I'd thought about updating my will, whether I had a financial advisor, whether my estate planning was in order. I told him everything was handled. He said that was great, just great, and we hung up. I called my lawyer the next morning. I want to explain something about estate law in British Columbia, because it matters to what came next. Under the Wills, Estates and Succession Act, a surviving spouse has certain rights, but so do dependents. If I were to pass without a current will, or with a will that hadn't been revisited in years, the distribution of my assets could become complicated in ways I hadn't thought through since my wife died. My existing will had been written when the kids were young. I hadn't touched it since the funeral. My lawyer, a quiet man who'd handled my business sale, walked me through everything methodically. I updated my will. I restructured how my investments were held. I made certain that the money I still had, roughly $600,000 in registered and non-registered accounts, plus the family home, was protected and documented properly. I also asked him a question I'd been turning over for weeks. Given that I had contributed significantly to the purchase of a property I had no legal interest in, was there any recourse if that property were sold without my knowledge? He was honest with me. He said that without documentation, a loan agreement, a promissory note, anything in writing, what I had given them was legally a gift. It was gone. I thanked him and drove home feeling something I hadn't expected to feel. Not anger, but clarity. The following Tuesday, my daughter called. I could hear it in her voice before she said a word. That tightness, that careful pause before she starts a sentence. She told me they were thinking of selling the house, that the Penticton market had been strong, and they'd had some interest from a neighbor who wanted to buy privately. She said they were thinking about relocating to the Lower Mainland. Something about a job opportunity for her husband. I asked her what the house would sell for. She said probably $780, maybe $800 if they pushed it. The house I'd helped them buy had been listed at $549. I knew that because I'd read every line of the MLS listing before I wired them the down payment. I asked her what they planned to do with the proceeds. She got quiet in a way that told me she already knew this conversation wasn't going where she hoped. She said they'd use it to get established in the Lower Mainland, maybe put a down payment on something there. She said they'd been under a lot of pressure. I didn't say anything about the $94,000. I didn't say anything about the will, or the lawyer, or the investment pitch. I just said I understood, and that I hoped things worked out, and we hung up. I need to be honest about what happened inside me in the weeks that followed, because I think it's the part people don't talk about. I wasn't only angry, I was ashamed. I kept running over the moments where I should have seen it. The inconsistent income, the new jacket at Easter, the casual question about my estate planning, and I felt foolish in a way that was almost physical. I'd survived 31 years in business by being careful. I priced jobs to the penny. I read every contract before I signed it. I never lent tools without getting them back. And yet I'd handed nearly $100,000 to a man I never fully close trusted because he was married to my daughter, and I didn't want to be the kind of father who made his child feel like the help came with conditions. I had 1 cup of coffee each morning, looking out at the lake, and I made myself sit with that feeling until it became something I could use. I didn't want to punish my daughter. That's the thing I need you to understand. She had not planned any of this with him. I was almost certain of it. But she had known. She had known about the mortgage supplements. She had known her husband wasn't working the way he said he was, and she had stayed quiet and let me keep writing checks. That was her choice. I couldn't make it for her, and I couldn't undo it for her, but I also wasn't going to pretend it hadn't happened. I started making some quiet inquiries. A former colleague of mine, now retired from a career with the RCMP, met me for lunch at a place we both liked near the Mission. Over salmon burgers, I told him what I'd observed. Not what I suspected, not what I felt, what I had observed. He listened the way people who've spent decades hearing stories learn to listen, without moving much, without offering conclusions until the other person is finished. When I was done, he asked me two things. He asked whether I had documentation of the transfers. I said yes, every one of them, bank records going back 2 years. He asked whether my son-in-law had ever made any representations to me, in writing, in text, in email, about his income, his business activities, or the purpose of the money. I went home and pulled up 2 years of text messages. It took me the better part of a weekend, reading carefully, making a folder on my laptop, but it was there, not dramatic, nothing that looked like fraud on its face, but over time, a pattern, references to the investment group moving forward, assurances that things were picking up. A text from 14 months ago that said, and I'm quoting exactly, "Don't worry about the last transfer. I've got a deal closing next week that'll more than cover it. We'll pay you back double." That last part, "we'll pay you back," was something, because a gift doesn't get paid back, a loan does. I brought everything back to my lawyer. He looked at the text for a long time. Then he said something I've thought about many times since. The question isn't whether you can prove fraud. The question is whether you want to go to court, and what you want to happen when this is over. I thought about that for several days. What I wanted, and I'll be plain about this, was not to see my son-in-law in handcuffs. I've never been that kind of person. What I wanted was for him to understand, concretely, and without any possibility of misunderstanding, that what he had done had consequences. And I wanted my daughter to understand the same thing, even though it would hurt her. Maybe especially because it would hurt her. Because the alternative was to let them sell that house, disappear to Vancouver and start over. And, somewhere down the road, when things got inconsistent again, my daughter would call someone new. My lawyer and I put together a formal demand letter. It outlined the transfers, referenced the specific texts, characterized the money not as gifts but as loans made under representations of repayment, and demanded repayment of $62,000. A conservative figure we could document clearly, within 30 days, with the alternative being a civil claim in BC Supreme Court. We sent it registered mail to the house in Penticton. My daughter called me 40 minutes after it would have been delivered. She didn't yell. She was past yelling. She sounded like someone standing in a room that had just lost all its furniture. She said, "Dad, what is this?" Not even a question, just those 4 words. I told her it was exactly what it looked like. She said he had told her the money was gifts. She said she had believed him, and then she got quiet in a way that told me she was doing the same math I had done, sitting in my truck in the driveway, and arriving at the same uncomfortable place. I told her I loved her. I told her none of this changed that. I told her that what her husband had done, and what she had allowed to happen by staying quiet, had put me in a position I hadn't chosen, and I was responding the only way I knew how to respond, which was carefully and with documentation. She hung up. My son-in-law called the next morning. He did not sound charming. He sounded like a man who had believed, until 36 hours ago, that he understood the terrain, and was now realizing he'd been reading the wrong map. He said the letter was out of nowhere. He said he'd always intended to make things right. He said my daughter was devastated. He used the word family 4 times in the first 2 minutes. I let him talk. When he stopped, I said, "You told me in a text message that you would pay me back double." I have that text. My lawyer has that text. If you'd like to discuss repayment terms, you can contact my lawyer directly. If you'd prefer to let this go to court, that's also available to you. He said he didn't have $62,000. I said I was aware of that. He asked what I wanted. I told him. A charge registered against the title of the Penticton property, prior to any sale, securing the amount owed. That was it. Before they sold that house to the neighbor or anyone else, my interest had to be registered and protected. He went quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You'd do that to your own daughter?" I said, "I'm doing this because of what was done to me. The two things are different." He hung up. My lawyer filed for a certificate of pending litigation the same week. It's a mechanism in BC that allows you to register a claim against a property while litigation is ongoing, which effectively prevents the property from being sold or refinanced without the claim being addressed. It's not complicated. It's not dramatic. It is, however, extremely effective. The private sale to the neighbor fell through. I didn't hear from my son-in-law for 6 weeks. I heard from my daughter once briefly, a call that felt like she was standing outside a room she wasn't sure she wanted to enter. She asked if there was any way to resolve this. I said yes, through my lawyer. She said she'd talk to him. 3 months after the demand letter, they settled. Not for the full $62,000. I'd been prepared for that. We agreed on $48,000, structured as a charge against the property that would be paid out at the time of sale. My son-in-law signed. My daughter signed. My lawyer filed the paperwork. The house sold 4 months later. I received a bank draft for $48,312. The extra $300 being an adjustment for interest. I deposited it. I didn't celebrate. I sat in my kitchen and drank a cup of coffee and watched the lake and felt mostly tired. The way you feel after you've carried something for a long time and finally put it down, and you realize the weight has changed the shape of your hands. My daughter and I didn't speak for almost 5 months after the sale closed. The silence between us was not angry, exactly. It was something more like grief. She knew what had happened. She knew what she'd allowed to happen. And I think she needed time to decide what she thought of herself on the other side of it, before she could figure out what she thought of me. She called on a Sunday in early spring. I was out back, turning over the garden beds for the first time in years, something I'd let go after my wife died and had decided, that particular weekend, to reclaim. She said hello. I said hello. She said she was sorry. Not for everything. Not in a big formal way. She just said, "I'm sorry, Dad. I should have told you sooner." I said I knew. She said her husband had moved out 3 weeks earlier. She didn't offer more than that, and I didn't ask. We talked for a while about the garden, about what I was planting, about whether the growing season had been decent that year. Small talk that wasn't really small. It was the conversation two people have when they're deciding to still know each other. I won't tell you everything healed cleanly after that. It didn't. There are things that happened in those 2 years that I still think about, still feel the shape of, when I'm alone in the house at night. The moment I first saw that summary sheet in my accountant's office, the look on my daughter's face at Christmas, the year before I found out, happy, I think genuinely happy, not knowing that everything underneath that happiness was built on something rotten. What I can tell you is that I didn't act out of anger. I acted because I understood, finally, that letting things go unchallenged was not the same as being generous. It was just being complicit in my own diminishment, and I was too old and had worked too hard to go out that way. My son-in-law, last I heard, had relocated to Alberta. I don't know what he's doing there. I don't ask. My daughter comes to visit every few months now. She brought my granddaughter last time, a quiet, watchful little girl who looks disturbingly like her grandmother. We walked down to the waterfront and I bought them both ice cream and we sat on a bench and watched the boats. On the drive back to the house, my granddaughter fell asleep in the back seat. My daughter looked out the window for a while, and then she said quietly, without looking at me, "You could have just let it go." I thought about that for a moment. Then I said, "I know, but I didn't." She nodded. Not agreement exactly, more like recognition. That was enough.